The wind coming off the river cut sharp and cold, sweeping leaves along Portland's waterfront like scraps of paper. The harbor cranes stood against the fading sky, black silhouettes reaching upward as the sun slid down behind them. Noah Reed snapped shut his battered toolbox with a tired finality. The click echoed faintly in the evening air. His fingers, cracked at the knuckles, smelled of grease and motor oil. His jacket, heavy with workshop dust, still carried the lingering warmth of machines and fluorescent lights. He had been working since dawn, first on cars, then on a courier's broken bike at the cafe nearby. The repair had been simple, but his body felt the weight of too many long days. All he wanted now was to sink into the driver's seat of his van and disappear into the quiet. He reached for the handle when he heard it. A cough. Not a small, ordinary cough, the kind that comes and goes with the cold. This one was rough, tearing, too big for such a small chest. Noah turned, the sound pulling him like a thread. On the old stone steps of a weathered brick apartment building sat a little girl. She looked impossibly small against the broad steps, her legs drawn up, arms curled tightly around a threadbare teddy bear. Its fur was matted, its ear torn, a hospital tag still dangling from the seam. On her wrist, pale and fragile, a white plastic band caught the last trace of light. The letters on it were unmistakable. Children's Ward. Noah's breath caught. For a moment he could not move. The sight pressed into him like a weight old and familiar. Too familiar. The evening noises of the city receded, the distant honk of traffic, the whistle of the wind against the cranes. All that remained was the thin figure of the girl, her curls falling forward, her small body shivering against the stone. Something inside him tightened. He had seen this before. He had lived it before. And once he had lost. He stepped forward, slowly, each motion careful, as though approaching a wild bird that might vanish at any sudden move. Noah hesitated before speaking, lowering himself slightly so he wouldn't tower over the girl. His voice came out softer than he expected. "Hey, you all right out here?" The girl's curls shifted as she lifted her head. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the fading light, but her eyes were steady, clear and far older than they should have been. She hugged the worn bear tighter, its button eye scratched and dull. "My name's Ella," she whispered. The syllables clung to the cold air, fragile, like a thread. Noah repeated it carefully, as though saying it out loud would keep her anchored. "Ella, where's your mom?" She tilted her chin toward the stairwell behind her. The brick wall carried the smell of damp and peeling paint, a building too tired to care for its tenants. "She's upstairs. But I can't make it." Ella's voice dropped to something conspiratorial, almost playful but with a strange gravity. "If you carry me up, I'll tell you a secret." It should have been the request of a child angling for attention. But the way she said it, raspy, deliberate, felt like a test. As if she was weighing him, deciding whether he was someone who could be trusted. Without another word, Noah extended his arms. She leaned into him without hesitation. When he lifted her, the shock of her weight, or lack of it, nearly buckled his knees. She was so light it hurt, as though he were carrying absence wrapped in a small coat. Her thin arms circled his neck, her cheek resting against the worn fabric of his jacket. The stairwell swallowed them in shadow. Old plaster crumbled near the ceiling, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the air. His boots echoed on the stone steps, steady but loud in the silence. With each step upward, he felt the frailty of her body against his chest, every shallow breath pressing into him. Halfway up, Ella's head shifted closer, her lips brushing the collar of his jacket. Her whisper was barely audible, yet it carved itself into him. "My mom is lonely. When I'm gone, promise you'll take care of her." The words struck him with such force that he stumbled, catching himself against the banister. For a second, the echo of his misstep filled the stairwell. He tightened his grip on her, afraid she might slip through his arms like smoke. He wanted to ask, what did she mean by gone? Why did her voice sound so calm when speaking of something that should never belong to a child? But she had curled her fingers into the fabric of his jacket, holding on with a quiet trust that silenced every question. Noah swallowed hard, his throat dry, his chest tight. The only sound left was the rhythm of his footsteps, steady but heavy, carrying them both toward the dim light spilling from the landing above. By the time they reached the apartment door, his heart was pounding so fiercely it drowned out everything else. Her words lingered long after the stairwell fell back into silence. "When I'm gone, promise you'll take care of her." The echo pressed into Noah's chest with every step, heavy and insistent. He had heard something like it before, years ago, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and wilted flowers, where his younger sister had looked at him with the same clear, unblinking eyes and said, "Don't let Mom be alone when I leave." He had failed her then, not because he didn't want to stay, but because he couldn't bear the sight of her slipping away. And when she was gone, he discovered absence was worse than watching. Now, with Ella's fragile body resting against him, that old wound split open like it had never healed. His arms tightened around her as if he could protect her from the words she had just spoken, as if his grip could keep her here. The climb to the third floor seemed endless. The walls smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and damp plaster, and the buzzing fluorescent light above flickered with a tired pulse. Ella didn't speak again. She only breathed, faint but steady, her cheek still pressed against his jacket. Noah's boots struck the steps with a rhythm too loud for the thoughts crashing through him. At last, they reached the landing. A narrow hallway stretched ahead, lined with worn doors whose paint had long since peeled. Ella stirred, lifting one small hand and pointing toward the last door on the left. "That's ours," she murmured. Noah swallowed, adjusting her carefully in his arms. He crossed the hall, his throat dry, and lifted his hand to knock. But before his knuckles touched the wood, the door opened. She stood there, tall, composed, with sharp lines to her face that spoke of discipline and control. Her hair was pinned back neatly, her blouse crisp despite the late hour. Yet her eyes betrayed her. Shadows of exhaustion circled them, and beneath the practiced calm there was a flicker of unease. "Mom," Ella said before Noah could speak. Her voice was suddenly brighter, more childlike. "This is Noah. He's nice." The woman's gaze shifted instantly from her daughter to him, scanning the stranger who stood in her doorway holding her fragile child. Something in her eyes hardened, an instinctive barrier rising between them. "Thank you for bringing her up," she said, her tone measured, careful. The kind of voice that belonged to someone used to control, to boundaries. Noah nodded slightly. She was on the steps. Looked like she couldn't make it on her own. A beat of silence stretched between them. The hallway light flickered, buzzing faintly above. Ella, oblivious to the tension, clutched her teddy bear closer and laid her head against Noah's shoulder as if she belonged there. Julia Harper. He would later learn her name, hesitated, then reached out. With gentle precision, she took her daughter from his arms, cradling her against her hip. Ella gave a small sigh but didn't protest. Julia's movements were graceful, but her eyes never left Noah. They held suspicion, gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite name. "Again, thank you," she said, this time softer but no less guarded. "We'll be fine now." The unspoken dismissal hung between them. Noah shifted his weight, uncertain if he should retreat or explain more. He caught himself almost telling her about his sister, about why this moment shook him so deeply, but he stopped. Words like that didn't belong on thresholds with strangers. Instead, he gave a small nod. "Of course. Take care of her." Julia inclined her head politely, already beginning to close the door. For a second, the light caught on the white hospital bracelet around Ella's wrist, and Noah felt his chest tighten again. Then the door clicked shut. He stood in the hallway a long moment, staring at the worn wood. The sounds of the building returned, distant television static from another apartment, the muffled argument of neighbors, the hum of the flickering light. But all he heard was Ella's whisper, "When I'm gone, promise you'll take care of her." He exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to the wall to steady himself. He didn't know this family. He had no place in their lives. Yet something had been set in motion, as inevitable as the tide rolling in from the river outside. When at last he turned to leave, the air in the stairwell felt heavier, charged, as though the simple act of carrying a child up a staircase had shifted something far larger than either of them could yet see. That night, after putting Ella to bed, Julia lingered in the kitchen longer than usual. The apartment was small, efficient, polished wood counters, orderly shelves, the faint hum of the refrigerator. Everything in her life had to be orderly, contained. It was how she survived. Control every detail, manage every risk, build walls high enough that no one could scale them. And yet, the silence pressed in. Ella's soft breathing came from the next room, but Julia's own chest felt empty. She poured herself a glass of water, stared at her reflection in the darkened window. For weeks she had seen her daughter grow quieter, weaker, smiles rarer, laughter fleeting. And then, suddenly, this stranger appeared, a mechanic of all people, someone who should have been a passing blur on the street. But Ella spoke his name with light in her eyes. Julia set the glass down, her fingers tightening around the counter's edge. She didn't trust easily. She couldn't. Men came with promises that crumbled. Neighbors came with curiosity that stung. And yet Noah Reed had asked for nothing. He didn't pry into her life. He didn't push. He simply existed near them, fixing light bulbs, repairing old machines, crouching to listen when Ella whispered her endless secrets. Julia wanted to dismiss him, to lock the door tighter, to shield her daughter from more disappointment. But when she had seen Ella's smile tonight, wide, unguarded, a glimpse of the child she used to be, something inside her had cracked. She touched the frame on the counter. Ella, before the hospital stays, before the endless fatigue, curls wild in the summer sun. A picture of joy that now felt like another lifetime. And against her will, Julia wondered, what if this man, this quiet, oil-stained stranger, was not a threat, but an answer? The thought frightened her more than the alternative, because hope was dangerous, and she had promised herself she wouldn't hope again. The storm broke just after midnight. Rain battered the windows in heavy sheets, each gust of wind rattling the old panes of the apartment. The air felt electric, thick with the charged scent of wet asphalt and thunder rolling in the distance. Julia had been working late again, documents spread across the small dining table, her laptop screen the only glow in the room. She told herself she could manage both, a demanding job and a fragile child. She had repeated the lie so many times it had become habit. Then she heard it, a thin, strangled cough from Ella's room. Not the ordinary cough she had lived with for months, but harsher, deep, tearing. Julia's heart lurched as she rose, the chair scraping back. She hurried into the bedroom and found her daughter curled tightly under the blankets, her little face flushed with fever, curls damp with sweat. Ella? Julia knelt at the bedside, brushing her hair back. The skin beneath her palm burned hot. Too hot. Mommy? Ella's voice was weak, hardly more than a breath. It hurts. Julia's chest clenched. She checked the nightstand, ibuprofen bottle empty, thermometer reading higher than it ever had. Panic tightened around her throat. She reached for her phone, dialing emergency services with shaking fingers. Ambulance, she demanded, her voice breaking. My daughter. She has a fever. She can't breathe properly. Please. The dispatcher's voice was calm, practiced, but the words landed like stones. Severe flooding on the main roads. Units are delayed. It may take up to 40 minutes. 40 minutes? Julia's voice cracked. She doesn't have 40 minutes. She hung up, hands trembling. Rain pounded the windows harder, thunder splitting the sky. She felt the edges of helplessness closing in, the walls of her carefully built life crumbling in one violent instant. She looked at Ella, who was gasping now, clutching her bear weakly. And without thinking, she typed a message with desperate fingers. Noah, please, help. She barely hit send before a clap of thunder drowned the sound of her sob. 7 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Not frantic, not hesitant, just firm, steady. Julia flung it open. Noah stood there, rain streaming down his hair, jacket soaked through, boots caked in mud. His chest rose and fell with the effort of running, but his eyes were steady. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Where is she? Julia stepped aside wordlessly. He moved past her, his wet jacket dripping onto the floor, heading straight for Ella's room as if he already knew the way. He crouched beside the bed, his large, oil-stained hands suddenly impossibly gentle as he brushed the damp curls from Ella's face. "She's burning," he muttered, then looked up at Julia. "Hospital. Now." "But the ambulance. I've got the van. It'll move. Come on." The urgency in his voice cut through her panic. She gathered Ella in her arms, clutching her daughter's frail weight against her chest, while Noah grabbed his keys. Rain pelted down harder as they dashed through the stairwell, Julia shielding Ella as best she could, Noah leading the way. The van door slammed shut behind them, the inside smelling faintly of motor oil and leather. Noah turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life. "Hold her steady," he said, his voice calm despite the storm outside. The van lurched into motion, wipers straining against the torrent of rain. Streets glistened with floodwater, headlights cutting through curtains of water. Julia held Ella close, murmuring soft reassurances, though her own voice trembled. Noah's hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white, eyes locked on the road. He swerved past stalled cars, his jaw tight, every muscle in his body braced against the storm. And yet, through the chaos, he kept speaking. Not to Julia, but to her daughter. "Hang in there, Ella. We're almost there. Just a little longer." Something in his voice was steady, anchoring. Julia found herself clinging to it, her panic tempered by the quiet certainty of this man who had no obligation to be here, and yet was. When they reached the ER, Noah was the first out, swinging open the van door and lifting Ella into his arms without hesitation. He carried her through the automatic doors, his shirt still dripping, ignoring the stares of startled nurses. "She needs help now," he barked, his voice sharper than Julia had ever heard. Doctors and nurses rushed forward, guiding Ella onto a stretcher. Julia followed, her hands shaking, her eyes burning. She felt Noah's presence behind her, not leaving, not stepping aside. His hand brushed her shoulder, steady, grounding, before slipping away as the medical team surrounded her daughter. The next hour blurred into white walls, questions, monitors, and the antiseptic smell of the hospital. Julia answered what she could, but when her voice faltered, Noah's voice filled the silence. Calm, precise, as though he knew how to speak the language of crisis. When at last Ella was stabilized, the fever breaking under the glow of machines and medicine, Julia sank into a chair outside the room. She buried her face in her hands, trembling, the weight of exhaustion and fear pressing down all at once. Beside her, Noah sat quietly. He didn't speak, didn't intrude. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder. Large, warm, steady. And in that small gesture, something inside her gave way. Not into panic this time, but into a fragile, unexpected relief. For the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely alone. Hospitals have their own seasons. Days and nights blur into one long corridor of beeping machines, rolling carts, and the smell of antiseptic. For Julia, time became measured not by hours but by numbers, blood counts, oxygen levels, fevers that rose and fell like tides. She learned to read the shadows under Ella's eyes more accurately than any chart. Through it all, Noah kept showing up, sometimes with fresh batteries for a toy, sometimes with a blanket he claimed was spare, but smelled faintly of engine grease and rain. He never stayed too long, never intruded, but he was always there. And Ella glowed whenever he walked in, as if her frail body remembered how to be strong in his presence. It was Julia who began to wonder first. Why he seemed to know which questions to ask, which silences to hold. Why, when Ella coughed too hard, his face carried not only concern but something deeper, like recognition. One late night, when the ward was unusually quiet and Ella finally slept without stirring, Julia found Noah in the family lounge, staring at the vending machine without choosing anything. His jacket hung on the back of a chair, and for the first time she noticed the white square of medical tape peeking out from the bend of his arm. "You hurt yourself?" she asked softly. Noah glanced down, tugging the sleeve lower. "Just work. Happens a lot." But Julia wasn't convinced. The look in his eyes wasn't the look of a man with a scraped arm. It was something else. Something hidden. Days later, the doctors mentioned a miracle. A donor had been found. Not just a partial match, but an almost perfect one. It was fast, too fast. Julia clung to the news with both hands, relief flooding her so powerfully she nearly sobbed right there in front of them. Still, at the back of her mind, a question stirred. The procedure went forward with quiet efficiency. Tubes, clear bags, numbers ticking upward. Ella drifted in and out of sleep, her teddy bear tucked under one thin arm. Julia stayed at her side, whispering promises into her hair. That she would be there every step, that she would never let her go. Noah was gone that day. He returned in the evening, pale, moving slower than usual. He claimed he had been working late, but his skin looked as though it had been drained of color, his shoulders heavier than she had ever seen them. Ella was too drowsy to notice, but Julia did. And when she caught a glimpse of the same white bandage again, this time wrapped tighter around his arm, she knew. The truth came not in a confession, but in a silence too heavy to ignore. They stood in the corridor, outside Ella's room, the hum of machines carrying through the walls. Julia spoke first, her voice low but unwavering. "It was you." Noah didn't pretend to misunderstand. He looked at the floor, then at her, his jaw tightening. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me," she said. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you already had enough to carry." His answer was quiet, almost a whisper. "You didn't need my ghosts on top of yours." Julia's throat ached. "You knew the risks. You—" Her voice broke before she could finish. "Why?" He ran a hand over his face, tired, raw. "Because once, a little girl asked me to stay and I didn't. I left, and I've been trying to live with that ever since." When Ella looked at me, it felt like I was being given another chance. For a long moment, Julia couldn't speak. The storm outside had passed, but inside her chest a different kind of storm raged. She looked at him. Not just at the oil-stained jacket, the tired eyes, but at the man who had quietly given a part of himself to save her daughter. She reached out, almost without thinking, and touched his sleeve. Just a light pressure of her fingers, but enough to steady them both. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered. "I did," he answered simply. Inside the room, Ella stirred, murmuring something in her sleep. Julia turned, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall with a rhythm steadier than it had been in weeks. And for the first time in a long while, hope didn't feel like a threat. Felt like a beginning. Spring came slowly, as if the city had forgotten how to thaw. Weeks of gray rain finally gave way to a softer light, and with it came Ella's laughter. Tentative at first, then bright enough to fill every corner of the apartment. Her cheeks regained a hint of color, her curls grew wild again, and the bear, now patched and restitched, never left her side. The hospital had become less of a prison and more of a checkpoint. Each visit ended with good news, each test returning stronger numbers. Julia still carried her folders of papers, her questions written in neat columns, but now she asked them with a steadier voice. Fear hadn't left her, but it no longer ruled her every breath. One evening in May, the small apartment filled with the smell of vanilla frosting. Julia had insisted on baking herself, though Noah had offered to pick up a cake from the corner bakery. She deserved something made with hands, not bought in a box, Julia said, dusting flour from her cheek. Noah only smiled, rolling up his sleeves to help, even when his attempts at decorating left lopsided stars across the surface. It was Ella's birthday, 6 years old. The living room had been transformed with ribbons and balloons, neighbors drifting in with small gifts and warm smiles. Mrs. Kowalski brought pierogi wrapped in foil, and the landlord's teenage son offered to play guitar. The building, usually tired and silent, pulsed with life. Noah lingered at the edge of it all, uncomfortable in a clean shirt Julia had teased him into wearing. He was more at ease with tools than with parties, but Ella kept tugging him into the center, showing him her new paints, demanding he taste every dish, laughing when he pretended the frosting was too sweet. As the candles were lit, Ella closed her eyes tightly, clutching the bear in one arm. The flamelight danced on her pale skin, on Julia's careful smile, on Noah's tired but steady gaze. She blew them out in one strong breath, the room erupting in cheers. Then, in the hush that followed, Ella climbed onto her chair, balancing precariously, her small voice carrying through the crowded room. "This is Noah," she declared proudly, pointing straight at him. "He's the one who can take care of you, Mom." Silence settled, deeper than any storm. Julia froze, her hand half lifted toward her daughter, but she couldn't bring herself to stop the words. Noah stood still, every muscle locked, as if the air itself had turned solid. Ella, satisfied, hopped down, tugging her bear close as though she hadn't just shifted the ground beneath them. Laughter returned slowly, nervous and warm, the neighbors clapping, conversations picking up again. But between Julia and Noah, time held its breath. Later, when the last plates were stacked in the sink and the apartment grew quiet, Julia found Noah on the balcony, the city lights glittering across the river. He stood with his hands resting on the railing, shoulders tense. "She's bold," Julia said softly, stepping beside him. Noah let out a low laugh, almost embarrassed. "Kids don't think about timing." "No," she agreed. "They just say what's true." For a long moment, they both stared out at the cranes against the night sky, their silhouettes black against the harbor lights. Julia's hand brushed his lightly as she reached for the railing. Neither moved away. "I spent so long building walls," she admitted. "Work, schedules, control. I thought it was the only way to keep her safe." She exhaled slowly. "But Ella, she doesn't want walls. She wants us." Noah turned to her then, eyes shadowed but steady. "And what do you want?" Her answer was quiet, but sure. "I don't want to be alone anymore." Silence stretched between them, but it was no longer heavy. It was soft, full, alive. Inside, Ella shifted in her sleep, murmuring in dreams. Outside, the city breathed with them, lights flickering on the water. And for the first time, Julia let herself imagine a future not defined by fear, but by the fragile, unsteady, beautiful shape of a family. Not perfect, not planned, but real. A mechanic, a mother, and a girl who had survived, bound together not by chance alone, but by the quiet courage of love that had waited for them all along.